I'd now like to welcome a colleague and faculty member at the University of Windsor as the advisor on Indigenous relations and community partnerships. I hope I got that right. Please join me. It's such a privilege and an honor to welcome Dr. Beverly Jacobs to the stage.
Scano Suquego. Giaso Gowenki Ganyangihaga Nyagway Shouta Hodinashoni. Greetings of peace to all of you. I'm Mohawk Bear Clan from Six Nations, Grand River Territory, and I told you my real name, which is Gowenkyuse, and it means she's visiting. So I have the honor to introduce an amazing person, Dr. Kelsey Leonard, and I want to be able to say just a few things about the importance of this conference, and thank the organizers for inviting me to introduce Dr. Leonard. I wear many hats. I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor, but I'm also a community member of Six Nations and committed to the work in community and the importance what that means to me and where I come from at Six Nations, Grand River Territory. And my colleagues, my water justice people are here too, Dr. Dawn Martin Hill and her daughter, Makasha Looking Horse, who are also doing work in the community, specifically on water governance, water sovereignty, and the importance of that from an Indigenous perspective is really the connections that we have, and that we've had those connections since time immemorial when it comes to our ceremonies and our laws and our language and our tradition and everything that carries us and holds us who we are to our people and our communities and our relationship to all living things, and our role as women in the rematriation and thinking about our mother, the earth, and our relationship as women, and not only to our mother, but to the water and the significance that has in our relationship to her. And, you know, I've been doing a lot of that educating about Indigenous legal orders, and the relationship to water is a major part of that, because water's life. We're all made of water. And if water doesn't exist, we don't exist. That was the basis of my PhD research. So that's really important to understand the relationship that we have as Indigenous people to our mother. That's who we are. That's our relationship, and that will never end. So I just wanted to mention that and to say, you know, as Indigenous people and our commitments to land back, water back, is really important, because that's our relationship to her, our origin stories, our creation stories always go back to our relationship to her. So I wanted to be able to recognize that water back, and that Dr. Kelsey Leonard has been doing this work for a long time as well. And, you know, she's in her bio, she's a water scientist, she's a legal scholar, a policy expert, writer, and enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. She's an assistant professor now in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, where her research focuses on Indigenous water justice and its climatic, territorial, and governance underpinnings. And so also in relation to that is her science lab and her water, climate, ocean justice, and the importance that has in the current state of research and the work she's doing with water back and rematriation and the return to Mother Earth and our relationship to her. So I'd like to welcome her and look forward to her presentation. I also wanted to acknowledge the elders and the knowledge holders and the relationship that we have with them, and their knowledge is really important. So to Myrna McKicknosaway and Lucy Harrison, and to my friend Kinu for helping today. So Nyawa, thank you.
Akwe Wanikasek. Hello, good day, everyone. It is wonderful to be with you. We're going to talk today, as my wonderful colleague, Dr. Jacobs, said, about waterback. To start, I want to present a visual abstract that my team of co-authors put together to acknowledge the publication of our paper about a year ago to the day. So let's see if this works. So what's really amazing about that video, one, you'll have tons of links this afternoon to all of the papers and resources that I'll be sharing with you. But what's really wonderful about this paper as well is our visual abstract and figure, not only the video, but what you can see there of our conceptualization of waterback, which was illustrated by Howley Pichette, who is just a wonderful Indigenous artist from Treaty 9 territory. And then the music that you heard, we tried to hamper it a little bit for those that are not hip hop folks. That was a native Tulalip hip hop artist named Brody Stevens who contributed that song as a courtesy to this project. And so just recognizing all of the wonderful minds that went into the creative illustration of this scientific endeavor. And I also wanted to highlight, as I'll go through in this paper later on, looking back 15, 20 years ago, I have a lot of people ask me, when did you know you want to be a water scientist? I'm like, I didn't know I wanted to be a water scientist. But now I think about that question, and I often respond to folks saying that, as I did in introducing myself in my language, that I'm a Shinnecock scientist. And Shinnecock in our language means people of the stony shore. And so I feel that our ancestors had a really keen insight and understanding of our responsibility to, as our lovely elder Lucy said earlier, to Agi, to, as we say in our language, Ogi, to Mother Earth. That if we are going to be calling ourselves Shinnecock people, that we have a responsibility to protect that shore. So whether I knew it or not, maybe perhaps Spirit was guiding me to understand that how I enact that responsibility every day in my life is through the role I now play as a water scientist, an educator, and all of those other little honorifics that were in my bio, as you can read. So I didn't think that 15, 20 years ago, I would be co-authoring this particular paper, because I could count on my hand how many Indigenous water scientists there were in our world. And now I don't have enough hands to count. And there's still more growing, as we saw from the beautiful student awards that were just presented. So what was really fortunate about being able to co-author this paper is, to my knowledge, it's the first time that we have a paper about Indigenous water scholarship fully authored by an Indigenous author team. So, thank you. I hope baby Kelsey and future baby Kelseys would be happy with that, to know that there are plenty of role models way beyond me who you now can look to, who are doing really excellent work to advance our understanding of Indigenous science, and in particular, Indigenous water science. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. So largely, our conversation today is going to center around the context of how do we think about water back in relation to health and in relation to our conference theme of one water, one health, thinking about the ways in which all of these things are interconnected. I also, as others have done, want to acknowledge that I'm a visitor on this lands and waters, and want to give my thanks to the many nations of the Three Fires Confederacy that allow for us to be here and gather today in their homelands and home waters. And because of their stewardship and foresight, we're able to have these types of convenings. But with that, I also know that human beings are really geography challenged. So I want to also show you the part of the world that I come from, which is on the east coast of the Atlantic seaboard of what we now currently call the United States and New York. And for those who are unfamiliar with Long Island, which is where my nation is located, it's called that because it's a very long island. And you're only seeing half of it in this map. This is the eastern portion, which is the traditional territories and waters of my people. But we're also known, which is a part of my story and how I come to be and live and work in the Great Lakes region, we're also known for our ability to harvest and carve what you may come to know as wampum, what we call wampumpiag. In our language, these are mollusk relatives that are quahogs, depending on which part of the Atlantic you're on, quahogs, and whelk shells. We eat everything, we use everything a part of that mollusk relative, and then the shell portion is what we carve into the purple and white beads that constitute the treaty belts and treaty agreements that have lived and persist throughout much of what we know as North America today, including the first transboundary water agreements of the Great Lakes. So I say all of that as a preface because many folks, including IAGLR folks, are unaware of that. So today in our conversation, I want to just provide a bit of an overview of what we found in the Waterback paper. I want you to also meet these beautiful human beings that created this work, provide a little bit of an introduction to what we mean when we say Waterback, look at some of the methods that we use, some of our overall findings, and within that overall findings, we're going to focus in on a few of the sub-conceptual themes of Waterback. And then you all will have a task, which is related to our database. So I'll share that in just a moment. So this paper that I've been mentioning and that you've seen the video and visual abstracts for is called Waterback, a review centering rematriation and Indigenous water research sovereignty that was published in Water Alternatives as a part of a new series of annual reviews called the Aware series that the journal has. And so I also just want to acknowledge Water Alternatives as a really amazing outlet and publication, and their editorial team for working with a very large Indigenous author team and really wanting to reimagine what Indigenous science publications can look like now and into the future. I say that because that is not the status quo. We often face racism in peer review. We often have desk rejects given to us just because we have Indigenous in the title of our papers, or something, or the characters that we use that are written in our languages aren't accepted by the portal platform. So there's things like that that have been real persistent barriers to Indigenous science being in the peer-reviewed publication platform space. And so this was a very refreshing, although there were still some challenges, shout out to the reviewers, but we worked through it together, and I think their editorial team really showed us what this could look like and how the future of Indigenous science publications could really be respectful and understanding of the ways in which our knowledge systems can interact with these types of publication outlets. So you can access the paper scanning that QR code because it is a probably law article length review paper, which is very not common, but that's the law scholar in me and some of the other law scholars on the paper coming out. But in giving that, we aren't able to go through the whole paper today. So I encourage you all to read it. I've had many people already using it in their classrooms and to really provide students with a state of the literature when it comes to Indigenous science and water. I do want to add the caveat, though, that as we said in the visual abstract, our literature review focused largely on the US, Canada, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia, in part because that's where our authorship teams is centered. And we didn't feel that it was authentic or ethical to be talking about places that we are not from. And you'll understand that when you read the paper, because it's the whole idea behind why we are arguing for the return of water research and the return and rematriation of our sovereignty over water research. So here are the authors, the beautiful human beings that helped to pen this work. We have Dominique David Chavez, DeAndre Smiles, Lydia Jennings, Rosie Allegado, Lonnie Susangini, Josh Manitowabi, Rachel Arsenault. Many of you may know Rachel's work, really beautiful scholar in the context of the Great Lakes. Renee Begay, Aurora Kagawi Vivani, Don Davis, Vincent Van Utrecht, Hauli Pichette. So how many of you have contracted with a graphic designer to make your figures in your papers? Show of hands. Quite a few. How many of you make your own figures? Okay, good. We really wanted to honor the contribution of Hauli because we went through all of these iterative processes with her of thinking about ways in which to have the final design and graphic really be reflective of what we were presenting in the research. And at the end of the day, contractual payment is not enough. We said that this is your intellectual property, and recognizing that you should also be a co-author. So Hauli, as our graphic thought thinker and thought leader, is also a co-author. Max Liberon, many of you may know her. Brad Mogridge, Stephanie Carroll, Ronaldo Sosi, and Andrea Gomez. And so we have these wonderful authors that make up this work, and all of us, again, coming from the US, Canada, Australia, or Aotearoa or New Zealand, but also recognizing that even within that, we have gaps because there's a lot of territory and nations to cover in those spaces. So what did we set out to do in this paper? Well, in large part, it was to understand the state of water research literature, to understand the state of where Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science is either being valued or not valued in the context of sustainable water management and thinking about governance and law and justice implications. We found that there really is a need for more collaborative approaches to understanding these complex, these wicked water problems that we see in our world today. We also recognize that we are facing, pun intended, these watershed moments, these moments in which we are seeing from institutions like the IPCC a recognition that colonialism has exacerbated the climate injustices that Indigenous peoples face every day. And so how is that intersecting with water in particular? And the paper begins to unpack a bit of that. We also really wanted to set the stage for the way in which we can understand these global movements around land back to also consider water back. And we recognize that some of the initial framings of these ideas around water back come from grassroots Indigenous activists, but particularly Indigenous youth leaders. We saw some of the work coming out of the Pueblo Action Alliance out of the Southwest, where, again, very arid communities, Pueblo communities, who were seeing so much devastation in terms of their access to water and the water injustices that were being waged against their nations, that they put out their own manifesto for water back. And we started to see these other trickles of youth, largely stemming from involvement in land back movements, saying, well, we can't have land back without water back. And particularly for an institution like IAGLR and those who are concerned not only with the Great Lakes of this region, but other parts of the world, it is very important for us and maybe innate for us to think that, of course, when we think about the ways in which we steward land, we can't forget how those systems are interconnected with water. What we also maybe didn't initially set out to do, but came out with, and we hope it is a resource to you, to your colleagues, to other Indigenous scientists who are endeavoring to do this type of literature review work in the future, is we actually wound up developing our own process, a process that we called Indigenous literature review process, a new methodological way of thinking about how we can engage with literature, particularly literature that is either written by Indigenous peoples or on the topic of Indigenous peoples. And we started by building relationships. And I would say the biggest part of this method is our process, again, thank you to the journal, was about a 3-year process for gathering information, working through the way in which we wanted to develop this methodological rigor. And so it started for us with building relationships. Some of you are natural physical scientists, and so perhaps you are well aware of working with author teams of more than 15 people. In the social sciences, and when you're fusing natural and social scientists together, that's not always the case. And so you face certain challenges when you're working with large author teams. But those challenges can also perhaps be indicative of ways that you need to slow down and think about how you build trust, and trust being one of those key foundations to a good and strong relationship. So we started with building relationships. And then we really amplified the way in which we thought about existing Indigenous methods. And there are methods that come out of many of our regions, including Australia, Aotearoa New Zealand, the US, and Canada, around how we gather knowledge, how we think about the way in which we bring in the literature. What do we find meaningful? And again, if you go into the paper, you can see how we define each of these steps and processes. But there's a way in which we sort of aligned it with how we think about gathering berries, how we think about gathering medicines, that we can gather knowledge in a literature review in a similar and akin process. The third step was then to synthesize and think through how we can empower collective storytelling and analysis of the literature. So really emphasizing our role as a collective rather than having individual readers, individual coders, we come back together. It really was thinking about how do we do that as a collective, and how do we empower our abilities and teachings around storytelling to analyze literature. And that then required a lot of meetings and group time and storytelling together and thinking through each of the different pieces of literature that we were reviewing. And then the last part of this process is the traditional literature review process may have steps that probably can match up or be mapped onto steps 1 through 3 of our process, but 4 is what we think is very unique and different, in that there's also a responsibility, as we see in other Indigenous research methods, for us to, once we've gathered all this knowledge, we've done the analyses, we're presenting our findings, that we have to also do so in a culturally respectful and meaningful way that also allows for us to give back. Sometimes literature review processes, at least within our perspective as Indigenous scholars, can be very extractive. They don't often have a foresight of what they give back to community, and we wanted to reimagine that. And you all will get to be a part of that a little bit later today. So what did we find? Initially, findings were centered around these themes. So we did not set out with these themes. These themes emerged from our initial process of gathering this literature and medicines. And so we saw that a lot of the literature was coming around themes of cosmology and governance, climate change, health, responsibilities and rights, justice, and colonialism. And where we saw the largest sections of literature was around health and cosmology and governance. And that's probably also maybe not shocking or surprising to the folks sitting in this room when you have a whole theme of a conference about one water, one health. and the way in which water is interconnected to how we feel, perceive, experience health, and how we even define that socially. So what do we mean by each of these different themes? The paper then goes through each of the themes and provides a bit of review of the papers that fit into these themes. Within water cosmologies and knowledge systems, we really were acknowledging that there needs to be a restoration of Indigenous water governance. We saw that there is now this global recognition of Indigenous water cosmology, traditional ecological knowledge. Sometimes this was gaining prominence in the literature, at least, alongside the emergence of Indigenous water declarations, such as the Kyoto Declaration in 2003. In this part of the world, we had the Chiefs of Ontario Declaration in 2008. And really, we started to see these holistic relationships that were prioritizing our kinship, our responsibilities, our reciprocity towards water in the literature on how we restore Indigenous water governance. In the theme of water colonialism, we really were referring to the historical and ongoing processes of settler colonialism and the settler colonial institutions and laws that enable the exploitation, the extraction, and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from water, not only the physical water, but also the processes by which how we make decisions about water are made. I can just kind of draw a little bit of an example. Is anyone familiar with the recent, it was last year's docket, but the US Supreme Court case on Navajo Nation and their water infrastructure bill? Yeah, few hands. If you're not familiar with that, I would encourage you to go and read it. But basically, the US Supreme Court said that per the treaties that the Navajo Nation had with the United States government, that the United States government was not responsible for providing them with infrastructure for their supply of fresh water to their communities. And yet the United States government is funding water pipelines from their territory to make sure that all of the lawns in Los Angeles are watered. That's what we mean by ongoing forms of water colonialism, where we can literally be dying of thirst while others take our water to have their lawns look green. And that brings up these aspects of justice. And I'll go back to the ideas that we have around water justice, which is really thinking about initiatives around water equity, water access. I love the work of the People's Movement of Detroit and Monica Lewis Patrick and the work that they've done around water affordability. And I think there's so much that our communities, both Indigenous and Black, have in the way in which we've been disenfranchised. And so water justice thinks about these institutions and these impacts of water affordability, water access. It bridges from the fundamental and foundational work of Dr. Robert Bullard in conceptualizing environmental justice, but it goes further. And it says, how are these sacrifice zones actually being laid across water? And how is water itself being sacrificed for our gluttony, for our consumption, for the way in which we want to overconsume? The next section was on water rights and responsibilities. This is where we get into a lot of the legal literature around Indigenous water science. There are rights-based frameworks for the lawyers in the room that largely connect to Western common law systems and systems of property rights. And then we also have responsibility-based frameworks, which more connect to Indigenous legal systems and Indigenous jurisprudence that emphasize relationality, responsibilities to the natural world, that there are collective rights rather than individual, and also recognizing that water is a living entity. In this section is also where you can find more of the information and literature about the transboundary water agreements being pivotal tools for establishing water rights and responsibilities, the ways in which the Great Lakes has succeeded and failed in managing water, the transboundary waters, particularly to the disadvantage of Indigenous nations along the waters. And We also found that Indigenous nations treaties, despite being the first transboundary water agreements in many parts of North America, they're frequently disregarded. And we're at this unique moment where we have, at least within Canada, the domestic adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which includes aspects of free, prior, and informed consent. We have endorsements and other quasi forms of adoption in Canada, Australia, and Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the United States. And so we're seeing these instruments, these international legal instruments, be embedded within our domestic legal systems. And it's going to really be a reckoning point of how do we reconcile this historic legacy of water colonialism and disenfranchisement with the potential futurity of shared waters and what that means for enabling rights and responsibility-based frameworks. We also had thoughts about water health. So we looked at instances of water quality, water safety, the cultural and spiritual significance of having healthy waters and the water itself being healthy for itself and not for human utility, and the way in which, human and water interactions are shaped by water health. And then the last section was water and climate change, and really thinking about how water is being impacted by the severity and extremity of climatic changes we're seeing across our planet. So as I said, we're not going to have enough time to go over everything today. So I wanted to narrow in on two aspects of the themes that came out of the state of the literature: water justice and water health. Two, I think, are very pertinent for everyone in this room and the work that you do. So in the context of water justice, we're recognizing water as a living entity. Indigenous science research is recognizing water as a living entity. And it goes beyond human-focused concepts of fairness, equity, and participation to really thinking about embracing relationality. Not only the implications of justice for humans, but what are the implications of justice for water itself? And it asks a very important question. What does the water need? Sometimes we don't ask that, or at least not everyone does. And so it really begins to emphasize that we acknowledge the rights of both humans and non-human entities while considering individual and collective responsibilities. So what I am working on now in my research, and have, I'd say, probably for quite some time, which is captured in the review, is this moment that we're in, this shift that we're seeing, a fundamental transformation in how we think about water. And it also begs the question of who is justice for? If we're talking about water justice, it's not just justice for humans, but for the water itself. And perhaps for the Great Lakes. And so that's where we're starting to see this emergence, not only in the literature, but in active scientific and grassroots movements to advance what we know as Earth law. It is an evolution from environmental law, where we start to recognize and honor and protect nature's inherent rights to exist, thrive, and evolve. It's the hope, which I think many of you share in this room, that we can create and steward a planet that emboldens a future in which humans and nature flourish together. But what we've seen historically, and although our environmental laws were created at a particular moment and snapshot in time where we had rivers on fire and cities consumed by smoke, they were reactive laws. They were reacting to crisis. What we're imagining now is that Earth law can be the law of what we want our future to be when we're not in moments of crisis, where we actually say, not only do we need, but what does the Earth need to be able to thrive and flourish? And so I can spout that all day long, and you can, hear my soapbox, but it may not be of much value to you. What I find value in is the successes that this is already having around the world. So it's a global movement. We're seeing constitutional amendments, court decisions, local ordinances, the reemergence and reclamation of Indigenous law. Many of you may be familiar with the recognition of the legal personality of the Whanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and many, many other cases around the world. So how do you go about doing this? Well, you can go for constitutional amendments like Ecuador did. You may be a little worried about trying to amend the Canadian or US Constitution. State constitutions, though, those have gone through some green amendments. Those have been pretty good. But you might have to start somewhere else. So local, municipal laws, even university laws, maybe having policies in your labs that think about the way in which you relate to the natural world. There's other ways in which you can advance these different types of initiatives, as you can see here. And colleagues and I, through what we call the Eco-Jurisprudence Monitor, have begun to map many of these initiatives around the world. There's thousands of them. You can scan this QR code to go to the monitor and search at your leisure. Either by political jurisdiction or by ecological jurisdiction, which I want to know all the mountains that have been recognized in the world, you can do that. And it's a really useful tool to not only be able to educate yourself, but to learn what are the ways in which these movements have been successful and how might I replicate those wise practices. There's another resource as well by the Earth Law Center, who works to advocate in these spaces, called the Earth Law Portal, which has already readily available templates, largely written for a US audience, but I do believe they have intent to expand that. So this can be a really great resource for teaching, for your classrooms. And on both of these portals, you have some Great Lakes examples. So this was previously presented at IAGLR. They may be around presenting, but I love the work of the Grand Council Treaty 3 folks with some of the leadership of May Craft and Dr. King, who put forward the Nebe Toolkit and the Nebe Water Declaration. It's a beautiful example of Earth law, of a water declaration, and of Indigenous law that is to protect water in the Great Lakes region. You also may be unfamiliar or familiar as of today with a bill that is moving its way through the New York State Legislature to recognize the legal personality of the Great Lakes. So New York State would be the first state to recognize the legal personality of the Great Lakes. We had a petition that was put forward by Indigenous water walkers for Parliament in 2017 that was unsuccessful to recognize the Great Lakes. And there was the former Bill of Rights for Lake Erie out of Toledo that was later struck down in the courts. But people are still fighting, and there's really wonderful change makers. And if you are a New York State resident, I encourage you to follow up with this congressperson, with your legislature representative, and see how you can help if you want to see the Great Lakes protected. There are also other organizations that are working on this: Global Changemakers, Bioneers, GARN, Harmony with Nature, Movement Rights, Indigenous Environmental Network, who are actively leading campaigns to ensure that there are the protection of water around the world. And we saw this in the literature. So this type of science and work is documented in what we know as water justice to enable water back. So the next section I want to take you through is called water health. And particularly, I want to focus on an aspect of that section of the paper that focuses in on water data. So we know that water data is critical for our understanding and managing water, right? We always say we need the best available science. Well, what if it's not being provided? What if it's not being collected? What if people are hoarding data? Some of you are guilty of that in this room. Indigenous peoples' water research sovereignty is the recognition that we have rights to collect, own, and govern water and data. It also says that when we're thinking about how we monitor water quality, that we have to be aware of the ways in which what our aquifer levels are, the basin interactions that happen with water quantity. All of that is critical for us to understand water health and water availability. And so we really need for there to be improved access to water data. So what we found as we were doing this research is there are a lot of places on the map that are white space. And what that means is these are areas that aren't being studied. And in particular, that we have an absence of Indigenous-led research, because that was the key of our water back paper, as we were surveying the state of Indigenous-led research. You can go to the paper if you're confused at how that is defined. But there are vast parts, even in the Great Lakes, where we're not seeing enough Indigenous-led research. And what that further means is that the amount of literature that talks about hydrological data, water data that is Indigenous-led is abysmal. So for me, one of the key takeaways of this paper was, well, there's obviously a clear connection between the water crises we're seeing in our communities as Indigenous peoples and the absence of data. And I want to do a quick shout out to Dawn Martin Hill and the work that McMaster University is doing, because one of her seminal grants was solely centered around this idea of how do we have Indigenous-led water data? How do we develop the sensors? How do we ensure that there's data sovereignty over the protection and curation and collection and management of that data into perpetuity? But Dawn is one person with a great team at one institution with one nation. We have thousands of nations across this planet that need more Dawns, that need more fiscal resources to support this type of data collection efforts. And for those of you that have those resources, that are getting the big NSF, NSERC data grants, shame on you for not sharing your data and making sure that it's Indigenous-led. A lot of the stuff I say is just be a decent human being. Like, this is going back to JK in preschool. Share your toys. Share your data. You're collecting it on Indigenous territories about Indigenous peoples. All of this land is Indigenous, so all your data is Indigenous. Share. And we have new concepts, which I'll go over in just a moment, like open data. Canada has a big push for that. US, not so much, but we'll get there. That empower this type of sharing and reciprocity and relationality. These aren't just words that we spew as Indigenous peoples. These are life skills, and we're trying to teach you them. So when we think about data sovereignty, I think that I added some of these slides because I heard a few of these questions coming through different sessions the other day, and a lot of people didn't know what it meant, so here you are. Indigenous data sovereignty is the authority of Indigenous nations that we hold under international law, particularly under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to manage data on Indigenous peoples, our territories, our cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and ways of life. The first seminal book on Indigenous data sovereignty, there's a whole book, was written in 2015. Great book. There have been now 3 or 4 subsequent books. There are multiple Nature papers published on Indigenous data sovereignty, and the work of Dr. Stephanie Carroll out of the University of Arizona. For those that are curious, what are Indigenous data? If you are working in Canada or the United States, you're working with Indigenous data. It's probably the simplest way I can say it. It's just whether or not you've actually acknowledged that. But it's data, information, and knowledge in any format that impacts Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at the collective and individual levels. And so I started working with the folks out of the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network back in 2015. We are part of a larger network called the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, and we developed what are called the CARE principles. How many folks have heard of the CARE principles? Show of hands. That's good. Sorry to shame everyone that didn't raise your hand, but you're not going to have your NSF proposal approved in about a year. Learn. QR code. These are now being embedded. Almost every major institution in Canada, your research management strategy profile has Indigenous data sovereignty and CARE principles as a requirement for your ethics and probably for funding. So you should learn Google and QR code. Also, NSF is now going to, they've already revised the proposal for how you engage with tribal nations. There are going to be future revisions to those types of proposals that will include aspects of Indigenous data sovereignty and the CARE principles. And I don't say this to be, what's the word? Scolding. I hope this is really helpful. Like, every non-Indigenous scientist I've worked with who wants to then collaborate with Indigenous scientists, and we talk about CARE principles, and they're like, oh, this is awesome. This is great. Like, this makes me think about how we do research in a whole different way. And this is good for everybody. And that's kind of the basis of Indigenous science. We don't just do it for ourselves. We've got some pretty good things that benefit everyone. So the CARE principles, you can find them here. How many folks have heard of FAIR before? Data folks, FAIR. Yeah, a little bit more show of hands. So if you're working with a data set, if you are really working with any type of data, you generally have been told to follow the FAIR principles, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so now through the GITA work, we say in the CARE principles, we say that you not only need to be fair and care, which stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And I'm a huge advocate for all of the principles, but I have a soft place in my heart for the responsibility principle because it's also where we advance and think about Indigenous languages and worldviews. And that is so important. I love, Alex's work where, he's really fusing the language into his research and into the title and abstract, and so many other Indigenous scientists that are doing that. And we need more of that because data systems and data sets, in large part, are promoting the monopolization of English around our world. And there's so much ecological knowledge embedded in our Indigenous languages that we have to ensure as data stewards and the scientists who are taking care of this data that we don't promote the loss of that ecological knowledge by not valuing Indigenous languages. So I said as we're coming to our end today that I've got homework for you. You all love homework, right? We give it to our students. So that fourth principle of our Indigenous literature review method process is that we don't just take from the world, we give back. And so we have a living water back database because we know there's human error. We probably missed something. Best attempts. There's always limitations to any type of research. We did find over 419 articles that we feel represent, and based on our methods, represent the state of Indigenous water literature. Now, this also caveat was from 2023, so there have been so many more pieces that have been published since then. And we want to capture that. So we made a living library through Zotero, which you can access all of the literature that we curated for that paper. And we are now open for contributions. So every year, we as an author team have made a commitment to update this database with contributions that are submitted globally. Hopefully that helps us to capture the literature that's in other languages, that's in other parts of the world. I know we have a beautiful delegation from the African lakes. If you all want to share and share some of your research, we'd love that. But for anyone, if you are interested in contributing to the database, you can scan this QR code. It will take you to a Google form. You can come back to it once you find all the literature you want to share. And there are a few questions that allow for us to be able to thoroughly catalog and ensure the stewardship of what you're providing to us. And this will be available through that Zotero library. So what goes into the Google form will then be readily available on that Zotero library for others to use in the future. And we hope that that is our way of giving back. So papers here, you can scan the code or use that short link. And I just want to say, Tabutni, thank you. It's been wonderful to be in conversation. Yeah, we've got 4 minutes. Want to take one? Okay, I've been given approval. We have 4 minutes. We can take one question, maybe two. We'll see how it goes. And we do, yeah. Lovely gentleman in the middle has a mic if you want to raise a hand.
Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. I'm curious to learn if you've noticed a difference between scientists in the United States and Canada in terms of working in right relationship with communities in this work.
It's a great question. No. I think there are differences because of the institutions that we have to operate in are different, right? An NSF proposal, I, I did one that was like, I don't know, some social experiment between Shirk and NSF, last year for an NFRF thing, and that was like total hellhole of fire. Yes, you can take that comment. And it's because these institutions, they're not made to interact. NSF has its own way of doing things, and the tri-councils have their own way of doing things. And then that trickles down to individual scientists. So there are some who do really great work, but they put in the hard work. Like, it is not easy because it's like you're learning a whole new way of being in the world. You're like a little toddler. And I think it takes humility to understand that if you're not Indigenous, you're a little toddler that's trying to learn the whole world and way of being. But if you can come with that humility of like, yeah, I'm a toddler and I am just here to learn and to be respectful and to find a way to build trust and relationality, then there are cool folks that have done really great things like that. Then there are others on both sides that don't do that and are a little bit more, we talk about in the paper aspects of extractive research, helicopter research, and that has been very prominent in Indigenous water research, and particularly historically. We were trying to be more strengths-based and really highlight Indigenous-led research in the paper, but there were a lot of bad case examples that I'm happy to talk with you offline about. But we just need to be doing more, and I think the CARE principles are a great first step in people who just don't know and sometimes are too afraid. That's like the biggest thing too. It's like, well, I don't know, but I'm also too afraid to do anything because I might be wrong. And then also living in the particular, what some folks like to call cancel culture today, I think it's accountability culture, that provides even more fear for people. Trust takes time. So start with the CARE principles, build strong relationships, and then the research will come from there. But more so, don't take money or funding that should be for Indigenous peoples out of Indigenous people's hands. Like, we are fully capable of leading our own research and doing it ourselves. We can invite you in.
Kelsey.
Sorry.
Kelsey here.
Yeah, one more? Okay.
Hi there. Thanks very much for this. My question, I'm actually kind of looking for some advice because I do a lot of work on agricultural land. And when we share data, we're quite open to sharing the data, but they really don't want us to share the locations. And I'm wondering how you would handle something like that for data sharing.
Excellent question. Just a quick follow-up. Agricultural lands held by private landowners, farmers, things like that. Yeah. So it's complex. I think a great place to start is identifying what are the nations that are implicated with that agricultural data. Okay, so yes, it may be legally held by a private landowner now, but it's still probably in a treaty territory or ancestral territory of a Indigenous nation or a set of Indigenous nations. Starting there and seeing if there's a way to reach out and build relationships with those nations to ask them, because it's really not for you to decide how to go about that. It's for them. The other caveat I will say is there's a lot of education building that needs to happen. CARE principles is one step. I didn't want to overwhelm you all with too much today, but there's another program called Local Context, which is a wonderful, who's familiar with Creative Commons? Like, you see the CC label and an ID tag somewhere. Well, Local Context is an Indigenous project of a similar vein. It's a way for us to protect the intellectual property of Indigenous data and affirm Indigenous data sovereignty. So you can Google Local Context, read about it, take some of their webinars. They have a system in which you can put a certain tag that, for example, they have what is called a notice, where you could put a notice of open to collaborate on a data set that is private landowner agricultural data that maybe you want to collaborate with Indigenous peoples on, but you're not sure, and you don't want to automatically send that data or make it open because there's other data sharing agreements that might need to be hashed out before. And so there are these ways that we can use notices and labels and a whole system already curated and created by the Local Context team that I am a real advocate for more scientists using globally when they're really thinking about how do we affirm Indigenous data sovereignty and the intellectual property rights of Indigenous nations. Hope that helps. All good. Okay, you get to go on break. Thank you.